The Pilot by James Fenimore Cooper, Chapter 2. A horseman's coat shall hide thy taper shape and comeliness of side, and with a bolder stride and looser air, mingled with men and man thou must appear. Priory. Then the whaleboat obtained the position we have described. The young lieutenant, who in consequence of commanding a schooner was usually addressed by the title of captain, stepped on the rocks, followed by the youthful midshipman who had quitted the barge to aid in the hazardous duty of their expedition. "This is, at best, but a Jacob's ladder we have to climb," said Barnstable, casting his eyes upward at the difficult ascent, "and it's by no means certain that we shall be well received when we get up, even though we should reach the top." "We are under the guns of the frigate," returned the boy, "and you remember, sir, 3 oar blades and a pistol repeated from the barge will draw her fire." "Yes, on our own heads. Boy, never be so foolish as to trust a long shot. It makes a great smoke and some noise, but it's a terrible, uncertain manner of throwing old iron about. In such a business as this, I would soon trust Tom Coffin and his harpoon to back me, than the best broadside that ever rattled out of the 3 decks of a 90-gun ship. Come, gather your limbs together, and try if you can walk on terra firma, Master Coffin." The seaman who was addressed by this dire appellation arose slowly from the place where he was stationed as coxswain of the boat, and seemed to ascend high in air by the gradual evolution of numberless folds of his body. When erect he stood nearly 6 feet and as many inches in his shoes, though when elevated in his most perpendicular attitude there was a forward inclination about his head and shoulders that appeared to be the consequence of habitual confinement in limited lodgings. His whole frame was destitute of the rounded outlines of a well-formed man, though his enormous hands furnished a display of bones and sinews which gave indication of gigantic strength. On his head he wore a little, low, brown hat of wool, with an arched top, that threw an expression of peculiar solemnity and hardness over his harsh visage, the sharp, prominent features of which were completely encircled by a set of black whiskers that began to be grizzled a little with age. One of his hands grasped with a sort of instinct the staff of a bright harpoon, the lower end of which he placed firmly on the rock as in obedience to the order of his commander. He left the place where, considering his vast dimensions, he had been established in an incredibly small space. As soon as Captain Barnstable received this addition to his strength, he gave a few precautionary orders to the men in the boat, and proceeded to the difficult task of ascending the rocks. Notwithstanding the great daring and personal agility of Barnstable, he would have been completely baffled in this attempt, but for the assistance he occasionally received from his coxswain, whose prodigious strength and great length of limbs enabled him to make exertions which it would have been useless for men to attempt. When within a few feet of the summit, they availed themselves of a projecting rock to pause for consultation and breath, both of which seemed necessary for their further movements. "This will be but a bad place for a retreat if we should happen to fall in with enemies," said Barnstable. "Where are we to look for this pilot, Mr. Mary, or how are we to know him, and what certainty have you that he will not betray us?" "The question you are put to him is written on this bit of paper," returned the boy, as he handed the other the word of recognition. "He made the signal on the point of the rock at yon headland, but as he must have seen our boat, he will follow us to this place, and to his betraying us, he seems to have the confidence of Captain Munson, who has kept a bright lookout for him ever since we made the land." "Aye," muttered the lieutenant, "I shall have a bright look out kept on him now we are on the land. I like not this business of hugging the shore so closely, nor have I much faith in any traitor. What think of you it, Master Coffin?" The hardy old seaman, thus addressed, turned his grave visage on his commander and replied with a becoming gravity, "Give me a plenty of sea room and good canvas where there is no occasion for pilots at all, sir. For my part, I was born on board a tobacco man, and never could see the use of more land than now, and then a small island to raise a few vegetables, and to dry your fish. I'm sure the sight of it always makes me uncomfortable, unless you have the wind dead offshore." "Ah, Tom, you are a sensible fellow," said Barnstable, with an air half comic, half serious. "But we must be moving. The sun is just touching those clouds to seaward, and God keep us from riding out this night at anchor in such a place as this." Laying his hand on a projection of the rock above him, Barnstable swung himself forward, and following this movement with a desperate leap or two, he stood at once on the brow of the cliff. His coxswain very deliberately raised the midshipman after his officer, and proceeding with more caution but less exertion, he soon placed himself by his side. When they reached the level land, they lay above the cliffs, and began to inquire with curious and wary eyes into the surrounding scenery. The adventurers discovered a cultivated country, divided in the usual manner by hedges and walls. Only one habitation for man, however, and that a small dilapidated cottage, stood within a mile of them, most of the dwellings being placed as far as convenience would permit from the fogs and damps of the ocean. "Here seems to be neither anything to apprehend nor the object of our search," said Barnstable, when he had taken the whole view in his survey. "I fear we have landed to no purpose. Mr. Merry, what are you to say, Long Tom? You see what we want?" "I see no pilot, sir," returned the coxswain, "but it's an ill wind that blows luck to nobody. There is a mouthful of fresh meat stowed away under that row of hedges, and would make a double ration to all hands in the Ariel." The midshipman laughed as he pointed out to Barnstable the object of the coxswain's solicitude, which proved to be a fat ox, quietly ruminating under the hedge near them. "There's many a hungry fellow aboard of us," said the boy, merrily, who would be glad to second Long Tom's motion if the time and business would permit us to slay the animal. "It is but a lubber's blow, Mr. Merry," returned the coxswain, without a muscle of his hard face yielding, and he struck the end of the harpoon violently against the earth, and then made a motion towards the poising of the weapon. "Let Captain Barnstable but say the word, and I'll drive the iron through him to the quick. I've sent it to the seizing in many a whale that hadn't a jacket or such blubber as that fellow wears." "Pshaw! You are not on a whaling voyage, where everything that offers is game," said Barnstable, turning himself pettishly away from the beast, as if he disturbed his own forbearance. "But stand fast. I see one approaching behind the hedge. Look to your arms, Mr. Merry, and first thing we hear may be a shot." "Not from that cruiser," cried the thoughtless lad. "He is a yonker, like myself, and would hardly dare run down upon such a formidable force as we muster." "You say true, boy," returned Barnstable, relinquishing the grasp he held on his pistol. "He comes on with caution, as if afraid. He is small, and is in drab, though I should hardly call it a pea-jacket, and yet he may be our man. Stand you both here while I go and hail him." As Barnstable walked rapidly towards the hedge that in part concealed the stranger, the latter stopped suddenly and seemed to be in doubt whether to advance or to retreat. Before he had decided on either, the active sailor was within a few feet of him. "Pray, sir," said Barnstable, "what water have we in this bay?" The slight form of the stranger started with an extraordinary emotion at this question, and he shrank aside involuntarily, as if to conceal his features, before he answered in a voice that was barely audible. "I should think it would be the water of the German Ocean." "Indeed, you must have passed no small part of your short life in the study of geography to be so well informed," returned the lieutenant. "Perhaps, sir, your coming is also equal to telling me how long we shall sojourn together, if I make you a prisoner, in order to enjoy the benefit of your wit." To this alarming intimation, the youth who was addressed made no reply, but as he averted his face and concealed it with both his hands, the offended seaman, believing that a salutary impression had been made upon the fears of his auditor, was about to proceed with his interrogatories. The singular agitation of the stranger's frame, however, caused the lieutenant to continue silent a few moments longer, when, to his utter amazement, he discovered that what he had mistaken for alarm was produced by an endeavor on the part of the youth to suppress a violent fit of laughter. "Now, by all the whales in the seas," cried Barnstable, "but you are merry out of season, young gentlemen. It's quite bad enough to be ordered to anchor in such a bay as this, with a storm brewing before my eyes, without landing to be laughed at by a stripling who has not strength to carry a beard if he had one, when I ought to be getting an offing for the safety of both body and soul. But I'll know more of you and your jokes if I take you into my own mess, and am giggled out of my sleep for the rest of the cruise." As the commander of the schooner concluded, he approached the stranger with an air of offering some violence, but the other shrank back from his extended arm and exclaimed with a voice in which real terror had gotten the better of mirth, "Barnstable, dear Barnstable, would you harm me?" The sailor recoiled several feet at this unexpected appeal, and rubbing his eyes, he threw the cap from his head before he cried, What do I hear, and what do I see? There lies the Ariel, and yonder is the frigate. Can this be Catherine Plowden?" His doubts, if any doubts remained, were soon removed, from the stranger sank on the bank at her side, in an attitude in which female bashfulness was beautifully contrasted with her attire, and gave vent to her mirth in an uncontrollable burst of merriment. From that moment, all thoughts of his duty, and the pilot, or even of the Ariel, appeared to be banished from the mind of the seaman, who sprang to her side and joined her in her mirth, though he hardly knew why or wherefore. When the diverted girl had in some degree recovered her composure, she returned to her companion, who had sat good-naturedly by her side, content to be laughed at, and said, But this is not only silly, but cruel to others. I owe you an explanation of my unexpected appearance, and perhaps also of my extraordinary attire." "I can anticipate everything," cried Barnstable. "You heard that we were on the coast, and have flown to redeem the promises you made me in America. But I ask no more. The chaplain of the frigate may preach as usual as to and to as little purpose," interrupted the disguised female. "But no nuptial benediction shall be pronounced over me until I have effected the object of this hazardous experiment. You are not only selfish, Barnstable. Would you have me forgetful of the happiness of others?" "Of whom do you speak?" My devoted cousin. I heard that 2 vessels answering the description of the frigate and the Ariel were soon hovering on the coast, and I determined at once to have communication with you. I have followed your movements for a week in this dress, but have been unsuccessful till now. Today I observed you to approach nearer to the shore than usual, and happily, by being adventurous, I have been successful. God knows we were near enough to the land, but does Captain Munson know of your wish to get aboard his ship?" "Certainly not. None know of it but yourself. I thought that if Griffith and you could learn our situation, you might be tempted to hazard a little to redeem us from our thraldom. In this paper I have prepared such an account as will, I trust, excite all your chivalry, and by which you may govern your movements." "Our movements!" interrupted Barnstable. "You will pilot us in person." "Then there's 2 of them," said a hoarse voice near them. The alarmed female shrieked as she recovered her feet, but she still adhered with instinctive dependence to the side of her lover. Barnstable, who recognized the tone of his coxswain, bent an angry brow on the sober visage that was peering at them above the hedge, and demanded the meaning of the interruption. "Seeing you were hull down, sir, and not knowing but the chase might lead you ashore, Mr. Mary thought it best to have a lookout kept. I told him that you were overhauling the mail bags of the messenger for the news, but as he was an officer, sir, and I nothing but a common hand, I did as he ordered." "Return, sir, where I commanded you to remain," said Barnstable, "and desire Mr. Mary to wait my pleasure." The coxswain gave the usual reply of an obedient seaman. But before he left the hedge, he stretched out one of his brawny arms towards the ocean and said in tones of solemnity suited to his apprehensions and character, "I showed you how to knot a reef point and pass a gasket, Captain Barnstable, nor do I believe you could even take 2 half-hitches when you first came aboard the Spousmicity. These be things that man is soon to expect in, but it takes the time of his natural life to learn to know the weather. There be street wind galls in the offing that speak as plainly to all that see them, and know God's language in the clouds, as ever you spoke through a trumpet, to shorten sails. Besides, sir, don't you hear the sea moaning, as if it knew the hour was at hand when it was to wake up from its sleep?" "Aye, Tom," returned the officer, walking to the edge of the cliffs and throwing a seaman's glance at the gloomy ocean. "'Tis a threatening night indeed, but the pilot must be had and—" "Is that the man?" interrupted the coxswain, pointing towards a man who was standing not far from them, an attentive observer of their proceedings, at the same time that he was narrowly watched himself by the young midshipman. "God send that he knows his trade well, for the bottom of a ship will need eyes to find its road out of this wild anchorage." "That must indeed be the man," exclaimed Barnstable, at once recalled to his duty. He then held a short dialogue with his female companion, whom he left concealed by the hedge, and proceeded to address the stranger. When near enough to be heard, the commander of the schooner demanded, "What water have you in this bay?" The stranger, who seemed to expect this question, answered without the least hesitation, "Enough to take all out in safety, who have entered with confidence." "You are the man I seek," cried Barnstable. "Are you ready to go off?" "Both ready and willing," returned the pilot. "And there is need of haste. I would give the best 100 guineas that ever were coined for 2 hours more use of that sun which has left us, or for even half the time of this fading twilight." "Think you our situation so bad?" said the lieutenant. Follow this gentleman to the boat, then. I will join you by the time you can descend the cliffs. I believe I can prevail on another hand to go off with us." "Time is more precious now than any number of hands," said the pilot, throwing a glance of impatience from under his lowering brows, "and the consequences of delay must be visited on those who occasion it. And, sir, I will meet the consequences with those who have a right to inquire into my conduct," said Barnstable haughtily. With this warning and retort, they separated, the young officer retracing his steps impatiently towards his mistress, muttering his indignation in suppressed execrations, and the pilot drawing the leathern belt of his pea-jacket mechanically around his body as he followed the midshipman and coxswain to their boat in moody silence. Barnstable found the disguised female, who had announced herself as Catherine Plowden, awaiting his return with intense anxiety depicted on every feature of her intelligent countenance. As he felt all the responsibility of his situation, notwithstanding his cool reply to the pilot, the young man hastily drew an arm of the apparent boy, forgetful of her disguise, through his own, and led her forward. "Come, Catherine," he said, "the time urges to be prompt." "What pressing necessity is there for immediate departure?" she inquired, checking his movements by withdrawing herself from his side. "You heard the ominous prognostic of my coxswain on the weather, and I am forced to add my own testimony to his opinion. 'Tis a crazy night that threatens us, though I cannot repent of coming into the bay, since it has led to this interview. God forbid that we should either of us have cause to repent of it," said Catherine, the paleness of anxiety chasing away the rich bloom that had mantled the animated face of the brunette. "But you have the paper. Follow its directions and come to our rescue. You will find us willing captives if Griffith and yourself are our conquerors." "What mean you, Catherine?" exclaimed her lover. "You at least are now in safety. 'Twould be madness to tempt your fate again. My vessel can and shall protect you until your cousin is redeemed, and then remember I have a claim on you for life." "And how would you dispose of me in the interval?" said the young maiden, retreating slowly from his advances. "In the Ariel, by heaven, you shall be her commander. I will bear the rank only in name." "I thank you, Barnstable, but distrust my abilities to fill such a station," she said, laughing, though the color that again crossed her youthful features was like the glow of a summer sunset, and even her mirthful eyes seemed to reflect their tints. "Do not mistake me, saucy one. If I have done more than my sex will warrant, remember it was through a holy motive, and if I have more than a woman's enterprise, it must be to lift you above the weakness of your sex," he cried, "and to enable you to show your noble confidence in me. To fit for me, and to keep me worthy of being one day your wife." As she uttered these words, she turned and disappeared, with a rapidity that eluded his attempt to detain her, behind the angle of the hedge that was near them. For a moment Barnstable remained motionless through surprise, and when he sprang forward in pursuit he was able only to catch a glimpse of her light form in the gloom of the evening as she again vanished in a little thicket at some distance. Barnstable was about to pursue when the air lighted with a sudden flash, and the bellowed report of a cannon rolled along the cliffs and was echoed among the hills far inland. "Ay, grumble away, old dotard," the disappointed young sailor muttered to himself when he reluctantly obeyed the signal. You are in as great a hurry to get out of your danger as you were to run into it." The quick reports of 3 muskets from the barge beneath where he stood urged him to quicken his pace, and as he threw himself carelessly down the rugged and dangerous passes of the cliffs, his experienced eye beheld the well-known lights displayed from the frigate, which commanded the recall of all her boats.